Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 123 CMMC. We are very happy to have our guest here today. My name is Dana Mantilia, and I am the founder of Identity Protection Planning. And our lovely guest today is Leslie Weinstein, and she has a company which works for HITRUST. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the company?
Sure. So my name is Leslie Weinstein. I'm a 15-year Army veteran. I've spent almost my entire civilian career with the military, with DoD. I'm a reservist, so I go on and off of active duty for the last 15 years. For the last 10 years, I have been a defense contractor working in OUSD-ANS, which is, of course, the office that has published the CMMC, and I've spent some time in DoD CIO. For the last year, I've spent time helping probably about 100 companies prepare for the CMMC and or NIST 800-171. And then a few months ago, I joined HITRUST. HITRUST is a standard setting organization. They've been in the business for the last 14 years. So it was a natural progression or transition to HITRUST.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great. And what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, all about CUI and how to write a CUI policy. So unfortunately, I think to get to how to write a CUI policy, there's a lot of topics that we have to talk about up front. The first thing being, what is CUI? So I want to bring up, I have the official definition on my other screen, so I apologize for looking over here to read it, because I want to read it because a lot of people, when they go try to figure out what CUI is, this is the definition that they come across, and this is what they read. But you will quickly see that it is not intuitive as to helping you figure out what it actually is. So CUI is defined in section 2002.4 of Title 32 CFR, quote, information that the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government, that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to handle using safeguarding or dissemination controls. Got that?
Woo, right. That is a mouthful.
Right. It's a run-on sentence. It has lots of ands, ors, this and that. So what does that mean? So that means that it's information that the government or an entity on behalf of the government creates or possesses. So what that means is that it has to have a government nexus. The government has to be asking you to create or possess this information. So we'll get into in a little bit about the CUI registry when we talk about how do I know if I have CUI. But information has to fall within a certain amount of categories for it to be considered CUI. And one of those categories that I like to talk about a lot is PII, personally identifiable information. So you may think, oh my goodness, PII is a category of CUI. Does that mean that my HR payroll, which contains PII, is that CUI? And the answer is no. If the government is not asking you to put that information together, then it can't be considered CUI. So it has to have that government nexus.
That's a great way. I really, really like the way that you're saying that, because that kind of helps hone it in. Wait, is this CUI? Is this not CUI? And by asking yourself, is the government asking you for this? That is really kind of helps, because it's such a mouthful, that whole thing you just read off about CUI, that I love that you're pointing out that way. So I just wanted to interrupt and say that.
And it has to be done under contract. So if you are submitting a bid in response to a request for proposal, and you're submitting a bid, the government will handle it as if it's CUI, but it is not CUI until it becomes a contract. And then any information and intellectual property that you're developing for the government under that contract, then it becomes CUI. But your proposal and that associated information is not necessarily CUI. Now, if you're referencing other information that was done under contracts with the government nexus, then that would be CUI, but your proposals are not. So yes, it does very clearly has that government nexus and under a contract. And I know this is a CMMC conversation, but CUI is a federal program. It's not just a defense program. So if you are a contractor and you have contracts with DoD and State Department and DOJ, you may generate CUI for all of them or for none of them, but you could have CUI for all of them. And the CMMC purview currently is just DoD, is DoD CUI. So this is kind of a question that I've had, an open question. What happens to my non-DoD CUI? Does that fall in scope for the CMMC? What if I segregate those networks? Surely a CMMC assessor wouldn't care how I handle state or DOJ CUI. They only really care about DoD CUI. So CUI is a federal program. It's been around for just over 10 years. It was established through an executive order under the Obama administration, and DoD just implemented the DoD CUI program last year. So how do you know if you have it? Everyone would love to say that the government should tell you, right? Well, you just heard me say that DoD just invented their CUI program, just published their CUI program through a DoD 5200.48 last March, I believe. So information that the DoD sent you 3 years ago and 2 years ago isn't going to be labeled as CUI because DoD didn't have a CUI program. It's probably going to say FOUO, or potentially has a distribution statement, or may say not for public release. Whatever DoD was using back then is probably what any information created before March of 2020 is going to say. So how do you know if you have it, right? So look to see if you have markings on it. If it has CUI markings on it, then you know you have CUI. Most likely. I mean, there are some cases where everything's marked as CUI. It's not necessarily, but that's a good indicator that it's probably CUI. Two, if it has any other legacy markings, if it's marked as FOUO for official use only, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's CUI, but you should at least give it a really hard double look to see, does this fall into one of the categories of CUI? And then there's potentially information that doesn't have any markings, or you're creating it. Because remember, the definition says that an agency can create it on behalf of the government. So absolutely, you can create a document that has no markings on it because you're creating it. So how do you know, right? The Information Security Oversight Office, the ISOO, they are the executive agent for the federal CUI program. They have a CUI registry on their website. If you Google ISOO National Archives CUI registry, you'll find it. It's really easy to find.
I'll put it in the description too for the video.
Okay, good. Yeah. But they have a list. They have index categories. Those index categories are not categories of CUI. They're simply groupings of CUI categories. But each of the categories, it's on the main table. It's on the right side, and it's a link. It's a hyperlink, and if you click on that, it'll take you to another page where it will describe very briefly what the CUI category is. And that will, you're supposed to, as the person creating the information, as the authorized holder, use your best judgment. Is what I'm creating within the scope of this short blurb? And if you still can't figure it out, if you scroll to the bottom of that page, there will be links to the laws or policies or whatever official documents make said information part of the CUI registry. So the links, there'll be links at the bottom. You'll be able to click on those, and it'll take you to the law or the policy that is being used to designate that as CUI. That will be lots of reading with fine print. You probably need glasses to read through all of the law and figure out the exact paragraph. It'll list, the CUI registry will list the exact paragraph sub number. So it'll be, paragraph 2003.4, paragraph F. So you go find that paragraph F, and that'll give you a pretty direct description of what the CUI is. And so you can look at what you're creating, and you have now two blurbs of information to try to figure out if your information is CUI.
So I have a quick question, real quick. So because this is the DoD CUI is new, are they going to go back and mark everything CUI?
Nope.
Or no?
No, so there's no requirement to go back and mark all of your legacy information. However, if you are creating a new document or using information that you've had historically, but you're creating something new and you're reusing that information, you should figure out if that information is CUI and then mark and label it appropriate as you use it. But there's no requirement to go back and relabel all of your troves of data. But the good news, so back to figuring out if this is CUI, these descriptions are vague. That is a huge complaint that people have. We need a classification guide. Well, this is as close to a classification guide as we're going to get. And the executive order is very explicit when it talks about this gray area. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, it says, if there's reason to believe that information is not CUI, then it shall not be so designated. So if you've done your due diligence, and you may want to bring in your legal team or have a lawyer friend to help you run it by some legal eyes if you have in-house counsel or maybe external counsel. You do your best effort and you say, we've really analyzed this information and we just don't think it's CUI. I maybe would document that somewhere and say that we handle this information. Some people may think it's CUI. We've done our due diligence and we don't think it is.
Okay.
Otherwise, you should mark it as CUI. But anybody who comes from the classified intelligence world, I've been an intelligence officer for the last 15 years.
Mhm.
We always err on the side of caution and overclassification because we want to be safe, but CUI is completely different. The program was established to share information legally and within the bounds of the way that it's meant to be handled. So the EO very much says err on the side of throwing caution to the wind. If you really don't think it isn't, if it can be argued that's not CUI, then it shouldn't be designated. Don't just say that everything we create is CUI, because that's not how the program was intended.
That was my question. I was going to say, well, should you err on the side of caution? We're just saying, well, let's just mark everything CUI.
Yeah, no, that's actually not how it was intended. The executive order is very clear when it talks about that. And there is room for you as an authorized holder or as a government contractor, if the government sends you information and they tell you everything is CUI or something is CUI and you looked at it and you really don't think it is, you can push back on them and you can question them and have that open dialogue. And the executive order encourages you to do that. Like, have that conversation. You can't just strip off the CUI marking and say, no, it's not, but you should go back and question their decision, because it does impact you in your system and your network and how you handle this data. If you really don't think you should be handling CUI because you really don't think your information is CUI, but the government's wanting to impose NIST 800-171 because they're trying to say everything is CUI, then it increased costs and risk and all of that good stuff. So who can handle CUI?
Exactly.
Some people think that there is a strict US person or US citizen requirement for CUI. And for CUI Basic, there's no requirement that everybody who sees it must be a US person. Now, there are some types of CUI, like CTI, Controlled Technical Information, that relates to ITAR, that has a US citizen / person, or it's US person requirement for the most part. Sometimes it's a US citizen, but it really depends on the type of information that you have. And the type of information that you have is determined by the CUI registry. The CUI registry will tell you when it's CUI Basic or CUI Specified, and when it's specified, if it's a US persons only or no foreign or US government only, or those kinds of things. So who can handle CUI is determined by the category of CUI that it is. There are two flavors of CUI, and I use the term flavor because that's what the ISU refers to it as. It's flavor. It's not categories. It's not types. It's flavors. Basic and specified. Basic is the basic generic store brand of CUI, that the basic handling requirements apply to this basic category. And then there's CUI specified, where there are additional marking and labeling requirements that are applied to these categories. It's not necessarily higher or lower. It's just, it has some additional caveats for how it has to be handled.
And just real quick, so, here's somebody who's trying to get ready for CMMC. They define their scope and who is in their scope. And so someone that is not in the scope should not be handling CUI. Is that correct?
Anybody who has a legal reason to view the CUI, there's not a need to know basis.
Right.
So unlike classified information, classified, it's a need to know, and you have to have the security clearance and the ability to know. CUI is really anybody who with a legal ability to see it. If you're a company with 50 people and all 50 people are servicing different aspects of DoD contracts, there's not a reason to scope out some of those people from this contract. And yes, that goes against our instincts for best practices. Like you should be segmenting off and giving access to only the people that need it. But there is not a strict need to know basis for CUI. Anybody with a legal, anybody who falls within that basic requirement of protection, anybody who meets that threshold can view it, because the government wants that information to be shared to further the government mission.
And this kind of ties into our next question, right? So what happens if you get CUI? So
if it's within your organization and somebody sends an email from a contract, but it's your teammate and you guys, work in the same office and you know that person, but you're all in the same network and you know that your environment's cleared for CUI, you're NIST 800-171 compliant, email that person back and be like, hey, wrong person, and then delete it from your computer, delete it from your recycling bin. However, if you're an organization and your environment is not NIST 800-171 compliant, or you're on your Gmail on your cell phone and neither one are, in scope for your company, and somebody sends you something marked CUI, no foreign, you're not in the wrong here, right? They are in the wrong for sending that to you. but you should still do your due diligence to destroy it appropriately. Like I wouldn't email back to them and risk it bouncing around the interwebs even more. I would destroy it in line with the ISU guidance for how to destroy CUI, but also email them back and say, hey, you sent this to me, you weren't supposed to, don't worry, you should worry it, but I destroyed it so that it's not going to escape from my environment, but please don't do that again. So don't freak out. You're not going to have the FBI like knock on your door because you got CUI or something, but definitely destroy it. Definitely let the person know that they sent it so that they can report it if they need to, or whatever their process is for an inadvertent spill of CUI, because it is referred to as a spill when you put CUI in an environment where it's not meant to be, or to an unintended recipient of the information.
Okay, so now what all these little companies are wondering is, how am I going to write a policy?
Yeah.
Easily, what's the easiest way to write a policy?
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's an easiest way to write a policy. So all of those little nuances and details, right, must be incorporated in your policy. You need to have a policy or procedure for what happens when, and how do I deal with this if. And that's the whole point of a policy and a documented procedure, right? It's that standard operating procedure for if I do get CUI, where can I put it? How do I store it? How do I know where it can go, right? And it can get really unwieldy and seemingly confusing and like, oh my gosh, there's this infinite world of what ifs and whatever. So, and I am no longer in the consulting business, but I do run a CUI website for this very purpose, because I put together a framework, and it's not meant to be any sort of like authoritative source or a data lifecycle framework, but I call it the CUI lifecycle because CUI has a life from conception, when it's written or produced or created, all the way until it's either decontrolled, which means it's no longer controlled as CUI and that information is not sensitive anymore, or it's destroyed, or it's disseminated. And you can disseminate it intact, where you just send the document, with no redactions, or you can redact information and send it with pulling out the CUI. So I put together the CUI lifecycle. And when you're writing a policy, if you write a policy, objective, and procedures for every stage of the CUI lifecycle, you won't miss anything.
Oh, that's perfect. Tell us the website so we can pop it there.
It's dodcui.com.
Okay.
And at the top, there's a link to the CUI lifecycle. I also have multiple other CUI resources out there, but I put together a really cheesy graphic because it was a free graphic design tool. But I wanted to put down in a picture, in a graphic format, like these are the steps. Like if you go through each one of these, you can't miss anything, because this is the whole life of it. And I also started a podcast, and I've started linking each podcast to each of the stages as I go through. So I'm only not quite halfway through with the life cycle of a podcast. I have another episode due this weekend. But that's where I kind of go through and peel back the onion on each of those steps. They're about 30 minutes long. They're super nerdy and nuanced and detailed, but so is CUI.
Well, that sounds very helpful. Very, very helpful. So we're definitely going to have a link so people can go and walk through, because that's what people are looking for, is walk me through step by step so I don't miss something. So that's perfect that you did that. Good. Yeah.
And there's no format for how a CUI policy has to look, right? I personally, if I had to write a policy for my company, I would address it through the life cycle. I would say, creating CUI, we use Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and whatever. And it's totally specific to your company. If you're a manufacturer, obviously you're going to have like CAD machines and all these other different things that handle CUI. So identify where CUI is created, right? Like if you outline it, that also helps with your system security plan, right? And scoping your technical environment, because you need to know where that CUI goes. And the CUI, or the CMMC, follows the CUI and the FCI for level 1. But yeah, if you follow the information and follow the life cycle from creation through destruction or dissemination or decontrol, you won't miss any steps, and that should help you scope your environment. So this should really be a pre-exercise to your CMMC preparation, because how do you know what the scope of your environment is and the scope of the people involved if you don't really understand where your information is flowing? And how do you know which information to scope besides figuring out if it's CUI?
Yeah, we are definitely going to have, sorry, my phone was about to ring. We are definitely going to have all these links in here, because this is really, really good stuff. I'm so happy that you're talking about all this.
Yeah, and I think we also need to briefly talk about FCI, the federal contract information, because I think that gets left out of the scoping discussion, and it shouldn't be left out of the scoping discussion. And here's why. Because FCI is it's everything else that's intellectual property that belongs to the government under a contract. It has the same government nexus requirement. It has to be done for or on behalf of the government under a contract, but it's everything that isn't CUI. So it doesn't quite meet the threshold of being considered controlled unclassified information, but it's literally everything else. And that has its own set of requirements to protect it. And that still has to be tracked within your environment. The FAR 52, which is equivalent to CMMC level 1, you still have to apply those protections to that bit of information or that type of information. So the CMMC assessment, in my mind, should include that level 1 environment. So wherever your FCI goes, make sure that that's, policed up as well and is not just running rampant through your whole environment, because in my humble opinion, that should be part of your CMMC assessment. Even if you're going for level 3 and you have an enclave here, if you have your FCI somewhere else, that environment still has to be assessed in some way, or at least considered as part of an assessment. And I don't know if that's a second assessment or something else. I'm not sure how that will play out or shake out with how it actually works in practice, but that information is also very important, and it's not CUI, but it could potentially come together to create CUI, and just like CUI can come together to create classified information. So it still merits protection and consideration when you're doing scoping exercises.
Yes. All right. So now what happens if I get CUI and it's not marked? Should I mark it? What should you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% mark it. And also if it has legacy markings on it, if it has FOUO or something else marked on it, what I would do, what Leslie would do, and what I would advise, my clients to do is I would line through the old marking. And if it is CUI, I would figure out the correct marking for it. If it's CUI basic, you can write CUI or controlled. And DoD requires headers and footers. But if I determined that it wasn't CUI, but it still has a legacy marking on it, I would still line through it and write unclassified, so that the next person that sees that document knows that somebody has looked at it and made the determination that it's not considered CUI. But if it has no marking on it at all, absolutely mark it, because CUI is CUI whether it's marked or not. So just because it's unmarked doesn't mean that it's not CUI. It just means that somebody didn't mark and label it appropriately.
Well, this is a very good question, because I'm sure there are people that are wondering, well, should I just let it keep sliding on through because it wasn't marked before it got to me? So
yeah, no. And so if you're handling ITAR data, if you have CTI, controlled technical information, which is technical information related to ITAR, every violation of the ITAR can be fined in some way. So for every time that unlabeled document or unmarked document is mishandled, can potentially equate to a fine amount or something. It's not a good thing to leave it unmarked. I would do my due diligence and mark it. And if you're unsure, ask a buddy, ask your supervisor, ask someone like, hey, can you help me mark this? Because if it's not within your scope of requirements, like you were never supposed to get a CUI document in your line of work, and so you're not trained on how to mark it, reach out to somebody and ask how to mark it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you have given us a tremendous amount of awesome information. So I'm going to make sure we have all these little links. And can you just explain what ITAR is for those in the audience that may not know what that stands for?
Yes, it's International Traffic in Arms Regulation. It's owned by the State Department, but it's related to or similar to the export EAR. EAR is non-military and ITAR is more the military and munitions. I am not an ITAR expert. I'm a CUI person. So I've had to learn a lot about ITAR lately, because no one's ever really done a test on this before. No one's ever had to test knowledge. So pop quiz, what are your ITAR knowledge? But I actually have a YouTube channel, and I have an episode on ITAR where I interviewed an ITAR expert. So if you guys are really interested in ITAR, it's Dib Tech Talk. And Mark Stevens was my ITAR expert. He has gotten LinkedIn famous since this, because I'm sure people are pinging him left and right about ITAR, because it does have such hefty fines and really major potential civil and criminal penalties associated with violating it. And CTI is a form of CUI and ITAR. So Very important. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much for all of your awesome information. Like I mentioned, we'll try to get all these links in there to all this great stuff, especially the whole one on your website that talks about writing the CUI policy and going through the life cycle of CUI. That's going to be very, very helpful. So thank you so much for that. So with that, we'd like to say thank you to everybody for your time. We appreciate you listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Bye.